Cleopatra VII, one of the most enigmatic and misunderstood figures in history. Was she truly a queen who seduced powerful men to stay in power? Or was she, in fact, a political mastermind navigating the treacherous waters of a crumbling empire? In popular culture, Cleopatra is often remembered for her affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But today, we'll dive deeper into the life of a ruler whose ambitions went beyond romance. Cleopatra's legacy is not just about beauty and seduction, it's about power, strategy, and survival. Segment 1. Cleopatra's early life and the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, they were Macedonian Greeks who took control of Egypt after Alexander's empire fragmented. The Ptolemies were notorious for their internal power struggles, with frequent plots, murders, and exiles. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by these political dangers. From an early age, she understood that to survive, she needed not just cunning, but allies and leverage. At the age of 18, she became queen, co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII in a politically fragile environment. But power sharing with her brother was never going to last. Soon, Cleopatra found herself ousted by a group of Ptolemy XIII's supporters. Instead of backing down, Cleopatra fled Egypt and began plotting her return to power. Segment 2. Exile and Return. Cleopatra's political genius in action. Cleopatra's exile could have been the end of her reign, but instead it became the turning point in her story. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra made the audacious decision to seek out the most powerful man in the world at the time, Julius Caesar. But was this about seduction or a calculated political move? Legend has it that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's private quarters, wrapped in a rug or a linen sack. While this story has become iconic, it wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a daring act of political negotiation. Cleopatra knew that Caesar, fresh from his victory over Pompey, held the key to her reclaiming Egypt's throne. Caesar's military presence in Egypt wasn't just about Cleopatra. Egypt was vital to Rome because of its wealth, particularly its grain, which fed the Roman population. Cleopatra, recognizing this, offered Caesar more than her companionship. She offered stability and control over Egypt, a crucial ally in the Mediterranean. Segment 3. The Power Play with Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's partnership with Caesar was one of mutual benefit. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth, and Cleopatra needed Caesar's military strength to remove her brother Ptolemy III from power. Together, they fought a civil war that culminated in Ptolemy's defeat. With Caesar's backing, Cleopatra was restored as queen, now with absolute power. It's easy to romanticize their relationship, but Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar was primarily political. While Caesar was in Egypt, the two leaders likely discussed not just their personal connection, but Egypt's future role in Rome's empire. Cleopatra was a visionary leader, understanding that her best chance of survival lay in aligning Egypt with Rome's growing power. The birth of their son, Ptolemy Caesar, also known as Caesarion, would become another strategic element for Cleopatra. She hoped that with a Roman heir, Egypt could maintain its autonomy, but as history would show, this dream would be short-lived. Segment 4. Cleopatra's Reign. Ruler, Diplomat, and Politician. Cleopatra's return to power was not just the result of her alliance with Caesar. She was a capable and ambitious ruler in her own right. Fluent in multiple languages, including Egyptian, Greek, and Latin, Cleopatra was one of the few Ptolemies to truly embrace Egyptian culture, presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis to legitimize her rule. Cleopatra expanded Egypt's influence through diplomacy and trade. Under her reign, Egypt's economy flourished as she opened new trade routes with Arabia, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. Her control over Egypt's vast resources made her one of the wealthiest rulers of her time, and she used this wealth to strengthen her political position. Cleopatra's diplomatic skills were unmatched. She knew how to play the long game, aligning herself with Rome but keeping Egypt's interests at the forefront. Her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of the Mediterranean was one of her greatest strengths, and it allowed her to hold power for nearly 20 years. Segment 5. Cleopatra and Mark Antony, Strategic Love Affair or Genuine Romance. After Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself in a precarious position. Rome was descending into chaos, with Caesar's supporters and rivals vying for power. Among them was Mark Antony, one of Rome's most prominent generals. Cleopatra's relationship with Antony has often been portrayed as a passionate love affair, but once again, there was much more at stake. Cleopatra needed Antony's military strength to protect Egypt from Rome's internal strife, and Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth to fund his campaigns. Their relationship was as much about strategy as it was about affection. Together, they formed a political alliance that would shape the fate of both Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra and Antony's partnership was not without risks. As Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, rose to power, tensions between him and Antony escalated. Cleopatra stood by Antony, providing him with the resources he needed to fight. But this alliance would ultimately lead them both to their downfall. Segment 6. The Fall of Cleopatra, Betrayed by History or a True Tragic End. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked the beginning of the end for Cleopatra and Antony. Facing Octavian's superior forces, their combined navy was defeated, and they were forced to retreat to Egypt. But Cleopatra was not one to surrender easily. As Octavian's forces closed in, Cleopatra sought a way to preserve her kingdom. She attempted to negotiate with Octavian, even considering handing over Antony in exchange for Egypt's autonomy. But Octavian had other plans. He wanted Cleopatra as a trophy in his triumphal parade through Rome. Rather than face humiliation as a captive, Cleopatra made a final, defiant choice. She took her own life, using an asp's venom to avoid capture. In death, Cleopatra maintained the dignity and control that she had fought for her entire life. Segment 7. The Legacy of Cleopatra, Seductress or Political Genius. Cleopatra's legacy has been shaped by centuries of myth and propaganda. Roman historians, eager to portray her as a villain, focused on her relationships with Caesar and Antony, painting her as a seductress who used her beauty to manipulate men. But Cleopatra was far more than that. In reality, Cleopatra was a brilliant strategist, a shrewd diplomat, and a capable ruler who navigated some of the most challenging political landscapes of her time. Her story is not just one of romance, but of power, ambition, and survival. Cleopatra was a queen who understood the game of politics better than anyone and played it to the very end. So was Cleopatra merely a queen of seduction, or was she a political mastermind who defied Rome's power for decades? The truth lies somewhere between myth and history, and it's time we give Cleopatra the credit she deserves as one of the greatest rulers of the ancient world. Cleopatra's legacy, rewriting history. Cleopatra's story is one that has captured the imagination of historians, artists, and filmmakers for centuries. But beyond the myths and the Hollywood glamour, who was Cleopatra really? Was she simply a queen who used her beauty to manipulate the most powerful men of her time? Or was she a political mastermind who played an intricate game of power and diplomacy? Let's start by addressing one of the most common misconceptions about Cleopatra, her so-called seduction of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. While history has often reduced her role to that of a temptress, Cleopatra's true brilliance lay in her ability to form alliances with the world's most powerful men. But these alliances weren't just romantic. They were deeply strategic. Cleopatra didn't seek relationships for pleasure. She sought them for survival, for power, and for the future of her kingdom. She ruled Egypt at a time when her kingdom was under constant threat from Rome's growing dominance. Cleopatra knew that her power could not last if Egypt remained isolated. She aligned herself with Rome's most influential leaders, not because she was driven by passion, but because she understood that Egypt's survival depended on it. Her relationship with Caesar wasn't merely a romance, it was an alliance of equals, both seeking to extend their influence. And what about her relationship with Mark Antony? Again, history often frames this as a passionate love affair, but Cleopatra was no ordinary queen. She offered Antony not just affection, but the financial resources he needed to challenge Octavian. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain, was essential to Antony's war efforts. Cleopatra didn't simply follow Antony to his downfall. She actively shaped the course of their combined destiny, attempting to carve out a future where Egypt remained a major power on the Mediterranean stage. Yet, despite her best efforts, Cleopatra's fate was sealed when Antony's forces were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium. In a world where the strongest military forces often dictated the future, Cleopatra found herself cornered. But even in the face of inevitable defeat, Cleopatra maintained her agency. She chose to end her life on her own terms rather than be paraded through Rome as a symbol of conquest. Her final act was one of defiance, a refusal to be reduced to a trophy of Rome's victory. The tragic end of Cleopatra's life is often romanticized, but there's a deeper significance. Cleopatra understood that the story written about her after her death would shape how the world remembered her, and she couldn't allow herself to be remembered solely as a defeated queen. In her final moments, she ensured that her legacy would not be one of submission, but of strength, intellect, and political mastery. In recent years, historians have begun to peel back the layers of propaganda that Roman writers spread about Cleopatra. As Octavian rose to power, he sought to diminish her accomplishments, portraying her as a dangerous foreign seductress who lured Rome's greatest men to their downfall. But this narrative was politically motivated, designed to make Cleopatra the villain of Rome's imperial rise. The reality was far more complex. Cleopatra was far from a villain. She was a leader who adapted to the immense pressures of her time, leveraging every tool at her disposal to protect her kingdom. She spoke multiple languages, governed a multicultural empire, and immersed herself in Egyptian traditions more fully than many of her Greek predecessors. Cleopatra was not only a queen, she was a stateswoman, a diplomat, and a cultural icon. Her legacy stretches far beyond her relationships with Caesar and Antony.